Hello and welcome back to Bite Size Boxing. Today we're going to be talking about the rumoured upcoming fight between Tim Tszyu and Errol Spence Jr. So Tim Tszyu is on the comeback trail a little bit himself. He's just had a comeback fight against a relatively nondescript opponent. I haven't actually seen it yet, but I've heard he kind of laboured to a points decision. It was clear, but it was the kind of guy who earlier on in his career you might have expected him to get out of there. That being said, as I say, Tim Tszyu is coming off of at least recent form, whereas Errol Spence Jr. has been missing in action for the last 3 years since his comprehensive beatdown to Terence Crawford. So, where do we start with both these fighters? For starters, as far as Tim Tszyu is concerned, I'm actually really surprised. Before I did this video, I just searched him up quickly and I was like, he's 31? He's 31 years old? What? Because Tim Tszyu, it feels like, has been around forever. And, you know, so is Errol Spence, right? But Errol Spence is 36 years old. Tim Tszyu is actually 5 years younger than Spence. But I think because he's been kind of on our radars for the best part of a decade now, he did take a bit of a time to actually get up to world level, but we've been aware of this guy because he's obviously cost Tszyu some for, as I say, about 10 years or so it feels like he's been around a lot longer than he actually has been, and as a result of that I was quite surprised to see he's only 31, and I think in a fight like this that probably makes all the difference and bodes well for Tim Tszyu. That being said, Tim Tszyu, I think it is fair to say, is probably past his best, even though he's not that old. You see, Tim Tszyu's kind of style, it was relatively attritional, but it was also, you know, he was a boxer-puncher. He wasn't just an out-and-out brawler with no regard for defense or anything. He was quite a sort of traditional boxer-puncher, but he could really get stuck in when needed. But unfortunately, the manner of some of his defeats as of recent, I think, have really knocked the stuffing out of him, and I don't think he's quite the fighter he once was. Of course, that first fight to Fundora, he ended up dropping a split decision. He got a really bad cut in that fight, and I think on the balance of play, he probably deserved to lose that fight from memory, but it was one of those where he was competitive in the fight, and he looked like he was getting the better of it up until he got that cut, but as soon as he got that cut, he was bleeding so much, he was looking very drained and weak, and he was really struggling to manage that cut, but it was a very bad one, so I'm not surprised. So he ends up losing a decision to Fundora. He then goes straight in there against Bakram Murtazaliev and gets absolutely cleaned out in, what was it, 2 rounds, something like that? So really not great. And look, at the end of the day, Bakram Murtazaliev, yes, he hits hard. Yes, he's a decent fighter, no doubt about it. But we've just seen Josh Kelly go in there and style on the guy for the most part. So it goes to show he is a beatable fighter. You know, he's far from invincible, and yet and still, Tszyu goes in there and gets absolutely iced. And Tszyu's someone who's always shown quite good whiskers up until that point, but you wonder if the fact that he does take quite a bit of punishment in his fights meant that his chin has degraded a little bit, and of course, if that is the case, the Bakram Murtazaliev fight would have done nothing to help that. He then goes in there in the rematch against Fundora and gets taken apart and beaten up in that fight. So that's where Tim Tszyu's at. You know, yes, he's had his comeback fight, but again, he's not been exactly setting the world alight. He's had 3 defeats relatively recently, and really all 3 of them have come in quite bad, quite bad for Tim Tszyu. You know, one of them being a really bad cut, and the other 2 being sort of comprehensive knockout losses. So as far as Tim Tszyu's concerned, I think he is definitely past his best. I think Tim Tszyu was one of those fighters because of his style. He kind of burned brightly, but for quite a short amount of time. You know, his prime was maybe only 2 years or something like that a few years ago. But I don't think he is quite the fighter he once was. That being said, I think we need to talk about Errol Spence. In my opinion, Errol Spence should be absolutely nowhere near a boxing ring at all. I don't even really know where to start with Spence. As far as Spence is concerned, I mean, this is a guy who obviously had that horrendous car crash, what was it, 7 years ago, something like that, and for my money has never looked the same since. Yes, he had his comeback fights. I think he fought, it's Danny Garcia, wasn't it, in a comeback fight? A very much shot-worn Danny Garcia, it must be said. And yes, he got by Garcia, but again, that isn't a prime Garcia, nothing close to it. You know, Garcia's best days were probably down at 140, getting on for a decade before then, right? At the point Spence fought him. He then goes in there against Ugas. Ugas, a world-level fighter as well, in his own right at the time. But there was a moment in that Ugas fight that was basically something I was hanging my coat on ahead of the Terence Crawford fight. And that was that moment where I think it was a right hook that catches Spence, and Spence completely short circuits and shuts down. And basically, he's almost like knocked out on his feet, but then like dissociating at the same time. It was one of the weirdest things I've seen in a boxing ring ever. And that happened where he clearly just short-circuited. And again, Spence is somebody who has always been quite physically robust, and we've never seen anything like that in the past. And look, he's been in there against far bigger punches than Ugas. He's taken far bigger punches than that, and yet he gets hit by Ugas in that fashion, and he just seems to like short circuit. Now, for my money, I think that's quite clearly residual damage from that car crash. He was ejected out of what I think was the windscreen of the car, doing something like 100 miles an hour, something crazy, and face planted the pavement. So, look, even down to his speech, if you listen to an Errol Spence interview, go and do this, right? Go and listen to Errol Spence giving, say, his post-fight review after the Brook fight. Then go and compare his speech to any recent interview of Errol Spence. It is night and day. The guy has clearly sustained an awful lot of trauma, as I say, most likely, I think, because of his lifestyle outside of the ring. Of course, you had that car accident. You also had the fact that he was drinking. He was blowing up in weight between camps and this kind of thing. Really not living the life, to be quite honest, in that sort of period of maybe 4 or 5 years leading up to the car accident and then maybe a little bit after. And so he become a world champion. He beat Kell Brook in good fashion. And then he just went off the rails. And then, of course, it all capitulated when he had that car accident. So for me, I mean, Errol Spence, by the time he got in there against Terence Crawford, the reason I've quite strongly favoured Crawford was because Crawford, yes, he was older, but he was way, way better preserved than Spence. Even stylistically, I think, Crawford has everything for Spence. Spence is a good fighter, but he's a well-rounded fighter. Spence is a 7 or 8 out of 10 in all departments, but he's not outstanding in anything he does. He's just incredibly well-rounded and very well-schooled. But I think you need to be a bit less straight up and down to beat someone like Crawford, to be fair. I think you need to be a bit more dynamic. That being said, as I say, I think the guy just already by that point accrued way too much damage in and outside of the ring. And so now we have this guy who's been out the ring 3 years. All of what I've just said still is true. It's still a factor. And he's going in there against a much younger Tim Tszyu. Yes, Tim Tszyu has looked awful as of recent, but I expect Errol Spence, if he does get back into the ring, to look completely shot. And look, I thought he looked pretty shot in the Crawford fight, to be honest, but it's only going to be worse, especially when you're pushing 40 now. You've had all of those half fights, all that damage, and again, for my money, I think is displaying signs of neurological decline. Even if you want to take it that bit further, the lifestyle outside of the ring, the impulsivity and things, all of this points towards neurological damage, right? We all know what I'm inferring here. Early onset CTE and the like, you start seeing people's characters change, how they behave change, a lot of the people they hang around with changes, they become far more impulsive, and all of this is true of Errol Spence. The speech starts to go, I think that is there as well. Some people might say it's because he had all those new teeth put in, because he had his teeth knocked out in that car accident. Maybe, that could be a fair point, that might be it. But for me, his speech has become way more slurred and slowed, and he just doesn't sound anywhere near as with it. And when you look at him, right, he looks more glossy-eyed, he almost looks glossed over in a lot of interviews now. He doesn't look, he almost looks medicated. I'm not saying he is, but you know what I mean? He looks that kind of way to me. So I think, as I say, Errol Spence is, for his own health, he should be nowhere near a boxing ring. He made a massive bag for that Terence Crawford fight, and I just want to see him stay retired now. Of course, he probably doesn't want to go out on that and be known for that. He probably wants to have a comeback, and even if he goes in there against a Jew and he manages to beat him, it's a good way to go out, right? But at this point, I don't want to see this guy take any more damage than he already has, because, as I say, for me, I think all of the red flags and the alarm bells are there, that there are serious issues with this guy in terms of the damage that he's taken, and I just don't want to see it compounded, to be honest. And look, Tim Tszyu, as I said, he's damaged himself. In my opinion, Tim Tszyu is quite clearly past his best also, but he is better preserved than Errol Spence at this point. So maybe it is because I assume, would this be a PBC show? Maybe they're just quite desperate and they're just, they're trying to hang on to whatever they've got left, trying to match together rather than going the DAZN route. Maybe that's the plan. But again, I think you can do better than digging up the corpse of Errol Spence at this point, because, yeah, that guy's done. That guy's done. And look, Errol Spence still has a very passionate fan base. We all know that. So he will do well. It will attract viewers, this fight, of course. And all of the Spence fans will still tune in for it. I'm sure it will do well on pay-per-view and that kind of thing. But again, I think sometimes as a fighter, you need to know when to leave it alone. And for my money, it was years ago. So Spence, I don't want to see him back. Tim Tszyu, He does need to rebound. He does need to rebuild. I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing Zhu, even if he can string a couple of wins together, going in there against someone like Josh Kelly or something like that. I don't think that's, I think he could beat Josh Kelly even now, even a bit past his best, because I don't think Josh Kelly is particularly a strong world champion or anything like that. So, why not look at something like that route? Again, it's a winnable fight. It's a chance to become a world champion again. I would do that rather than digging up Errol Spence. But you let me know what you think. I'd be interested to know. And yeah, cheers. Take it easy, guys.